Good morning, colleagues. Can we start, please? Good morning, and I believe some folk had a rather good evening last night. I wasn't DM'd, so I don't know, but the rumors are floating, so might also... I was clearly left out, not cool enough, couldn't roll with the cool kids. Great to have everyone back this morning. We've got a fantastic day ahead. And all I want to do, because I want to dive right into the morning session, is just to start off with a few announcements. I'm not going to attempt to summarize anything from yesterday. You'll be grateful to know. The first announcement is just, apart from the interactive elements of the exhibition and what's in your bags, just to remind you that if you didn't get to work with the cards, please do so. And also, you'd have noticed we've got a colleague downstairs, Roska, who is sticking a camera and a microphone in people's faces. So that is part of our Urban Futures harvesting of your ideas linked to the exhibition. So we just, sort of for those who are willing and happy to, and if you haven't been approached, feel free to go and impose yourself on Roska. It is just for us to build different data sources of what people's views are on the questions that's on the board. The second announcement is at the end of the conference today, we know, you guys are gluttons for more knowledge, more information. There's a book launch at 5 o'clock, at 4:30 for 5. We're incredibly honored to be able to share this occasion with Professor Jenny Robinson, whom, no one in this room, she doesn't need an introduction. We all lean extremely heavily on her work to help us anchor this project of Southern urbanism. And her new book on comparative urbanism is being launched today in Cape Town. And there's some colleagues who will respond to that. Starts at 5 o'clock. It is in a completely different building, and we thought we'll give you some exposure to the slum side of the university. So you've got to make your way. Don't go by yourself, you will get lost. So do ask someone from ACC or UCT to guide you to the EGS building where ACC's offices are. And we squat within the EGS building, so you can also go and feel some pity for us while you're at the launch. And then another colleague of ours who was here on the first day of the conference, but not today, Kim Gurney, she just published a book called Panya Roots, which is about independent art spaces. And one of our partner organizations that we work with is Go Down Arts Foundation in Nairobi, and Joy Mboya couldn't join us this week, in part because she's been running this incredible month-long festival of events and activities and so forth. And one of those is an explicit connection with what we're doing here. And she felt, as a commentary on the way we curated the program, that she will have an event on cultural infrastructures tomorrow afternoon on Zoom. And Kim's work, which looks at 5 independent art spaces in 5 African cities and tries to extrapolate organizing principles from those cases, those institutional ethnographies, will be the kickoff plate for that conversation. We will circulate the Zoom information on ACC's Twitter and Facebook accounts, so you can have all the details. So that's tomorrow from 4 till 6 EAT. I think that means 3 till 5 in South African time. Those are the announcements. So this morning, and in a way, sort of referencing those 2 books is a great segue to the theme for the opening panel, which we've titled Soft Infrastructures for the Soul. And we, as Dilip will tell you, we have to draw on the poets and the writers and the artists and the designers to navigate these worlds for us. And in some ways, urbanists who are obsessed about infrastructure, we kind of lack a bit of imagination, to be honest. And so it is great, I think, as a counterpoint to some of the empirics and some of the hardness of yesterday's conversation, to start off and listen to the reflections and the practice of 3 amazing folk So Christian Benimana from the Africa Design Center in Kigali couldn't join us this week because he had prior commitments. We discussed him doing a video message and then decided, no, actually, let's just pull an extract from his TED talk because, that's so polished and beautifully done. And then I will give over to our two panelists this morning, Tessa Brunette, who is the sustainability leader for Africa, India, and the Middle East. So those are broad shoulders, Tessa. Those are three big regions. And then Thireshen Govender, who is the director and founder of UrbanWorks Architecture and Urbanism, and that I've collaborated with over many, many years to bring their unique perspectives to get us off and get the morning going. So without further ado, if we could roll the clip, please. Thanks.
Population will be slightly less than the current population of China and India combined. The infrastructure and buildings needed to accommodate this many people is unprecedented in the history of humankind. We have estimated that by 2050, we have to build 700 million more housing units, more than 300,000 schools, and nearly 100,000 health centers. Let me put that into perspective for you. Every day for the next 35 years, we have to build 7 health centers, 25 schools, and nearly 60,000 housing units each day, every day. How are we going to build all of this? Are we going to follow a model of unsustainable building and construction similar to what I witnessed in China, or can we develop a uniquely African model of sustainable and equitable development? I'm optimistic we can. I know Africans who are already doing it. Take Nigerian architect Kunle Adeyemi, for instance, and his work in slums of coastal megacities, places like Makoko in Lagos, where hundreds of thousands of people live on makeshift structures, on stilts, on water, without government infrastructure or services. A community at great risk of rising sea levels and climate change. And yet, people who live here are examples of great ingenuity and a will to survive. Kunle and his team have designed a prototype school that is resilient to rising sea levels. This is Makoko School. It's a floating prototype structure that can be adapted to clinics, to housing, to markets, and other vital infrastructure this community needs. It's an ingenious solution that can ensure this community lives safely on the waters of Lagos. This is Francis Kere. He works in the country where he comes from, Burkina Faso. Kere and his team have designed projects that uses traditional building techniques. Kere and his team working in the communities have developed prototype schools that the whole community, similar to every project in the villages of this country, come together to build. Children bring stones for the foundation, women bring water for the brick manufacturing, and everybody works together to pound the clay floors. Working with the community, Kere and his team have created projects that function better with adequate lighting and adequate ventilation. They appropriate this particular context and really, really beautiful as well. For the past 7 years, I have been working as an architect at Mass Design Group. It's a design firm that began in Rwanda. We have worked in several countries in Africa, focusing on this more equitable and sustainable model of architectural practice. And Malawi is one of those countries. It's a country with beautiful remote landscapes, with high peak mountains and fertile valleys. But it also has one of the worst maternal mortality rates in the world. A pregnant woman in Malawi either gives birth at home or she has to walk a really long journey to the nearest clinic. And 1 out of 36 of these mothers die during childbirth. In Malawi, with our team and mass design group, we designed the Kasungu Maternity Waiting Village. This is a place women come to 6 weeks before their due date. Here they receive prenatal care and train in nutrition and family planning. At the same time, they form a community with other expectant mothers and their families. The design of the Kasungu Maternity Waiting Village borrows from the vernacular typologies of Malawi villages and is built using really simple materials and techniques. The earth blocks that we used were made from the same soil of this site. This reduces the carbon footprint of this building, but first and foremost, it provides a safe and dignified spaces for these expectant mothers. These examples show that architecture and design have the power and the agency to address complex problems. But more to the point, that we can develop a model of effective solutions for our communities. But these 3 examples are not enough. 300 more examples will not be enough. We need a whole community of African architects and designers to lead with thousands more examples. In May of this year, we convened a symposium on African architecture in Kigali, and we invited many of the leading African designers and architectural educators working across the continent. We all had one thing in common. Every single one of us went to school abroad and outside of Africa. This has to change. If we are to develop solutions unique to us, rather than attempting to turn Kigali into Beijing or Lagos into Shenzhen, we need a community that will build the design confidence of the next generation of African architects and designers. In September last year, we launched the African Design Center to start building this community.
So this was just, please go and watch the full TED clip. I just wanted to give a sort of have Christian's voice in the room and give a sense of where he's coming from, his practice. And the Africa Design Center is precisely this intervention to address what he raises at the end of the talk. And when I was there 3 years ago, I spent 2 days just hanging out with this incredible group of young designers from across Central Africa and into West Africa. And yeah, it's transformative just to see people working and the kind of conversations and discussions they've had. So again, building on the theme of yesterday, there's some amazing things happening on the continent. Tessa.
Thanks, Edgar. First, I'm going to get the clicker.
Yes,
that's important. As an architect, I do have visual aids. So, hi everyone, and thanks Edgar and the ACC for inviting us to this really important conference. As an architect, it's really wonderful to think about how we have spatial agency and that the impacts of that will have longevity long beyond our lifetimes. So, as by way of introduction, as I said, I'm trained as an architect. This is my alma mater, so it's wonderful to be back and to see some of the colleagues from the School of Architecture here today. My context is Cape Town, so I will be talking very much around my own experience working over the last 20 years in Cape Town as a spatial practitioner with a very, very strong focus on sustainable outcomes. So my lens is largely a private sector lens, personally. That's been my experience. But within, of course, the company I work for, we do operate across all sectors. And I think between Thireshen and I will cover both sides of that. So one of the first things to think about when talking about soulful architecture or infrastructure and how we as spatial practitioners have agency in that. I think one of the challenges at the moment is that largely, and I'm going to be quite blunt, the brief from Edgar is be blunt, so I'm going to do that. Largely, I don't believe that our spatial practitioners fully realize their agency and the influence that they can have early on in the project. It's these early stage decisions that have the most impact, and we need to be quite cognizant of that. I don't believe that that's happening enough. Secondly, when it comes to place-based design, I don't think that we fully understand where we are. I don't think we fully interact with the environment. And as an example of this particular graph up there with lots of colors on it, basically talks to comfort. This is looking in Harare. We've recently been working on a project in Harare where we've pushed a sustainable outcomes agenda really, really hard. And one of the tools that I used to describe the ease of working in Harare with a wonderfully benign climate was this graph. Essentially on this, the red is uncomfortable, everything else is comfy. This is outside in the sun. As soon as you shade that, literally shade an outside area, you can see quite quickly how much of your year, your annual year, is actually comfortable. The little red bits that are uncomfortable are much, much more limited. So when we think about how this translates to building, actually all we need to be doing in a climate such as Harare is shading. But then we build stuff. That's what we do, right? We need to build stuff. There's a whole series of reasons why we do that. But as soon as we build things, we add levels of complexity that we need to understand and respond very directly to. I don't fully believe that this is understood, and I think that there's a lot of overcomplication that we introduce. Understanding where the sun shines from is a critical thing, and it's, again, largely not understood. We need to be thinking about where the sun shines from so that we can make the most possible use of every single space that we create as architects, as urban designers, as landscape architects, because every intervention that we have with precious resources that cost money and carbon and materials has to be contributing to a positive environment. So how does every step that we make work with the climate to create positive spaces? And finally, this idea of this aspirational design of glass boxes that we see largely from the Western world, which is directly related to gross consumption of fossil fuels, that results in these fantastically deep floor plate buildings with acres and acres of glass around them. This does need to shift because it results in buildings that have no comfort, no resilient comfort. If there's no electricity, you can't be comfortable because it relies entirely on air conditioning. So there's an opportunity for us to be working with that. The urgency, I don't think, is understood. So Michael touched on this yesterday. We have 1,000 days. That correlates roughly to 23 months. When the IPC report was issued a few months ago, it was 30 months. So we're now 7 months later, and I don't think much has shifted. Many of us have just come back from COP, and there's all sorts of reflections that we can gain from that. But fundamentally, it's urgent. We cannot kick this down the line anymore. The world is changing around us. We know this. We know this within our contexts. We are at the forefront of resilience. It's urgent for us. Equally, within an African context, we have this tremendous opportunity to shape our spatial future, to be inclusive, to be accessible, to be African. And what does that mean? That is why we're here today having this conversation. So within this African context, global context, look, this graph shows how much development is needed within an African context. We have agency, we have influence. That's why we're here today having this conversation. So, in terms of solutions, one of the things that really strikes me is that we need to be putting people at the heart of our design decisions. This particular project is not one of ours. This is an Indian colleague, Rahul Mehrotra, who I never pronounce the name right. And this project always strikes me because with very simple design moves, he has turned this entire culture of caste system on its head. This is an office building in Hyderabad where he surrounded the building with gardens, which is lovely and provides all sorts of microclimate benefits. But one of the key decisions was to make this garden, which you can see on the screen here, was to make it in need of maintenance. And then within this garden that surrounded the building, he built a series of walkways with the specific outcome that the people, largely women, who were going to be maintaining these gardens, needed to walk around on the outside of the building. And of course, between the outside of the building and the inside, where the typically men sit having their important meetings in air-conditioned spaces, they would be confronted by these women who were maintaining and looking after this garden, which gave them such a wonderful inside space. It's simple moves like this that I don't see within our regular lived practice in an African context. I don't see in many places. And I would love to think about how we can start to introduce this into our daily practice. Another point is on integrated design. We need to be working together. There's a balance of performance, the spatial vision, the architectural intent, and the budget that needs to all be working in harmony with each other in order to achieve the deep, sustainable outcomes that we require to really get to where we need to as both a decarbonized as well as resilient, inclusive, and accessible future. We need to be designing for the climate. Absolutely. I will talk about this until the cows come home because it really is my favorite topic, I would say. This is a building that we recently completed in Cape Town, working together with architect Studio Mass, where we made simple design moves that have resulted in the ability of the building to be naturally ventilated for up to 82% of the year. That correlates to potentially 80% reduced energy emissions. And that's possible through both changing the orientation and orientating the glass in better ways, but also by introducing simple things like opening windows. As soon as within our climate in Cape Town, incredibly benign climate, as there is over much of the continent, as soon as you can introduce opening windows, there's a humanity alongside a ready access to the benign ambient temperatures that exist. It's also about extending the definition of value. So this project, I'm sure many of you would recognize. This is the Zeitmacher at the grain silo at the waterfront. I've been involved in that project since 2012, and it definitely is soulful. I think it performs a role as social infrastructure, which is critical. But the point I'm making with this project today is that in building the business case for this project, clearly it's not financially viable, right? Like, the building is incredibly complex and expensive, and people are quite surprised often that it's built within an African context. But for the landowner and the property developer, who really do exhibit patient capital, their view was a long-term view. So they took a view of this project, not only in the capital cost of the thing and what this grain silo could be reimagined as, but rather for the impact that could have both on their property in terms of increasing the value of their property, as well as the role that could have as a destination for people. And the goal was to have it as a very accessible and inclusive place to be. So much so that it's actually the heart of the building, the atrium, which is this, the space that's in the photo, which is the architect's really heart, and that's what they imagine as the center of this thing. So alongside the definition of value, extending to include CapEx, OpEx, wider land value, it's also around understanding the value of the inputs and the value of our efforts as spatial practitioners and designers within an African context and South African context that can often be quite a compromised space. This is another project that we finished with 1 minute. Also extending the idea of CapEx and OpEx, and it's really important just to understand that from value. We also need to be learning from the past. So these are two buildings in Harare, Eastgate on the left and Harare International School on the right. I went to visit these recently. Both were built in the 90s. Where have we gone since then? Nowhere. We still refer to these projects as exemplars. So learning from that, and this is recent past, is critical. We also need to make sure that all decision makers are on board. There's quite a lot of reticence within the community, within the design community, around things that are different, things that are green, and we need to just make sure that everyone's on board all the time. We also need to be brave. We need to be pushing our boundaries and using our influence and our agency to drive decision makers' boundaries. Clients, quantity surveyors, those types of decision makers. But finally, we already have the building blocks. We're not learning new things. In fact, we've unlearned. So how do we relearn how to work with climate, how to put people at the heart, and create this accessible future and inclusive future that we have the opportunity to do? Thank you.
Thanks so much. Just, oops, just go straight for it.
Thanks. Can I take this? I'm in this section here.
Yeah,
Yeah? Okay. So I've got an obsession with type, and we couldn't get the type on that computer. So I'll jump straight in and just say thank you very much again to Edgar and colleagues. I really appreciate the opportunity to share some perspectives on it, and I think it's really nice to be part of yesterday's conversation to understand some of the heady matters that is shaping our urban conversation, and I thought that it'll be helpful for me to make a contribution to the micro nuances on how we could bridge these extreme polarities in our spaces. So I think that there's a few things that we can agree on. We're in a state of crisis where we're bombarded with a range of pressures that are making it almost impossible to operate in any meaningful and impactful way. So what I am interested to do is to present a case in the context of these extreme realities that we are facing about a way of practicing and looking. And there are three things to look at. One is I'm asking for something to be quite insurgent in the context of the urgency of the project that we need. I think we need to be looking for things that are quite consequential, meaning that what we do needs to have an impact beyond our immediate understanding. And I'm also advocating for something that is a little bit entrepreneurial. We can expand on that a little bit later. But there is something about the entrepreneurial spirit within our continent that we need to tap into as a dormant infrastructure that we could leverage a lot better. So as an architect, while it's interesting to draw and to make, I think I've played a largely observational role in my practice for a while. And what I am seeking in this particular moment in time is language and relations. I'm interested to reveal what they are and understand how they work. I'm interested to reveal the emerging values that are coming about, that's being presented through the lived, built form. And I'm also interested to understand the spatial mechanics and bring it back into both the academy and to practice to start talking about new ways of making and thinking. I would like to present this to 3 case studies, and they vary in scale from the home, the neighborhood, and the city, just to help us make these scalar jumps that is quite challenging, for me at least. So I'll start with the Shebeen. We're quite familiar with the typology in the Western Cape, and this is an example
Could I just explain what it is?
Oh, a Shebeen is an illegal tavern it's an adapted house. It's a private house that's been converted into a liquor venue. It's out of necessity as a type, and it's prolific within South African townships. What this drawing is, it's an ethnographic drawing of the Shebeen that integrates both the living arrangement of someone's house as well as their shop, basically their livelihood. These hybrid infrastructures, largely man-made, has got an unbelievable level of intelligence built into it. I'm suspicious of it in terms of opening up new ways of thinking about how we think about infrastructures for a really urgent urban conversation that's playing out. Through the studying of these infrastructures, these handmade urbanisms, there's interesting patterns about the social infrastructures behind it and this reciprocal relationship between the hard and soft infrastructures. And for me, I'm convinced about the underlying intelligence within these infrastructures, and the objective within my practice is to bring these to the surface for us to discuss. So the patterning within these infrastructures are important to me. If one has to move scale from the home to something a little bit bigger to start understanding the consequences beyond the immediate land footprint, I'd like to take you to Evelyn Street. This is in Namibia, in Windhoek, which suffers a similar kind of spatial trauma as South Africa does. And I would like to just draw the attention to the thing that we struggle with within our context is unbelievably limited resources. We don't have deep pools or pockets we can draw on, and we need to think about other instruments to leverage radical, rapid change within our cities. This drawing shows, with the red dots, the taverns and shebeens that were in Windhoek at the time, and all the state did at the time to say, we don't have the resources, but we won't criminalize your business if you happen to trade in these yellow zones. And immediately what happened afterwards was that every taverner operated within this high street on Evelyn Street. That's about 66 bars within 1.8 kilometers in 2008. So it's an interesting thing, because one is it does attract investment, but we're wondering, is it the right kind of investment? So the first move is quite a clumsy one, you could say, and it's a little bit awkward and uncomfortable. But what happens over time is that 8 years later, what we're starting to see is that there is an increase of bars, slightly, by about 8 or 10 bars. But more interestingly is the intensification of business life and economic life within this area that was made available just by relaxing a policy. There was no physical investment by the state into these spaces at all. Now, as an architect, I'm interested to understand what makes that setup play out, because there's something extraordinary about how all of those businesses could play out and what was the logics behind it. The red spaces here are the shebeens and the taverns. These are the kind of deviant typologies, often we consider pioneer typologies, that occupy these sites with a level of comfort and extra legality. With these shebeens, what we found is that there was an ecosystem of similar trades. You had a car wash, you had a hair salon, you had a mechanic, and you had a sishinyama. In Namibia, they call that a kapano, which is a street food cluster. So this little microcosms of business activities that were hinged along the high street made for a really interesting spatial arrangement that was made available through this setup. So if you look at the top here, and it's one of the key points that's been made in the argument is that we put this kind of infrastructure up with very little consideration. But built into this infrastructure is opportunity that we will build in for others to advance their ideas, which is a really interesting idea of how we imagine co-production. So that thing about the fat sidewalks, the backyards, the ability to invest, co-invest, and invite an activity in desirable areas is what becomes exciting for us. Now, we talked about structural inequality within South Africa and African context, and for me, if ever I had to find an example of what it means to have economic inclusion, this is the image that comes closest to it, on Evelyn Street, where you find a meta infrastructure, which is the high street, but people, irrespective of what their means are, they're able to participate in a spatially consistent manner on the high street, irrespective of what your means are. So here's someone that's operating with 1,000 Rand, to someone who's taking 100,000 Rand to optimize their property. And we think that that's quite interesting on how we could coordinate the micro efforts of people towards a common goal and objective. Now, when we talk about sustainability, one of the byproducts of this is that we have in Namibia a situation where the nighttime economy, where typically in South Africa businesses end at about 5 o'clock in townships, that here, because of the concentration of business activity, you've created an extra 4 hours of trading time, which is 50% more than your standard time. Now, we've really changed the spatial geography of how that area works by intensifying land uses on our spaces, which, Michael, as we talked about with the stresses we're putting on our mobility infrastructures, becomes interesting. This does create another kind of urban pattern that is counterintuitive, where some of the taverns and shebeens are shaping our urban form more than some of the state interventions like our markets, our bus systems, and transport systems. And I think it's important to understand those counter logics. To move up a scale, I'd like to just show you some of the cross-border economy work in downtown Johannesburg with our immigrant communities occupying some really precarious sites within downtown Johannesburg, but creating interesting agglomerations of trading activity that is ethnically kind of tracked in some way. So what you're finding is that the intensification of informal traders of foreign background are using some of the existing city buildings in the most extraordinary ways. So these buildings, typically offices, have been radically converted into vertical shopping areas. So if you look at one of those sites, there's 356 shops in there. That's about the size of the Mall of Africa in Johannesburg, which has got 400 shops in there. So that's a radically different way of thinking about how intense our cities could be. And the argument is to understand that both our hard and soft infrastructures need to be considered in making this. These drawings are showing what some of the micro moves are. So while we get excited about what the big city form is, they all start with really small adaptations, improvisations that do happen to have a patterning around how we create these opportunities and how they are claimed by the majority. Now, what becomes exciting about these micro-architectures is their ability to start changing city form and the regional form. So downtown Johannesburg, those areas or those markets do not serve Johannesburg at all. They serve the markets around Johannesburg and in our adjacent cities. And these conduits and routes are being made by, so say this is one of the routes between Johannesburg and Bulawayo, where you have these commuter buses that are being hacked to become freight buses. So what you do is you make a deal with the bus driver to store your eggs, your mayonnaise, your oil within various crevices within the bus, and suddenly you've converted an existing infrastructure into something a lot more productive and valuable, which makes an illicit kind of trade route within Johannesburg and South Africa. So I think what the ask for Edgar for me was to say, like, how do we deal with these interesting observations, and bring them and translate them into some of the commissioned exercises we have within our mandate as architects. So we look at, within South African context, we've got a really complex set of problems where our land uses are not consistent. We find that empty land within our state mandate is completely not colonized but claimed and occupied in quite aggressive ways, and it becomes really hard to manage a developmental agenda within these sites. So you find the way the private sector operates within our public sites and townships needs some kind of tactical, subversive way of dealing with it, and these drawings demonstrate a way of using those insights that we've seen and observed to make a counterpoint within our cities. So it's about building really small infrastructures that has a disproportionate impact within our communities around, and trying to leverage adjacent land uses and the entrepreneurial efforts of the majority of our citizens in a coordinated and strategic manner to work with the private sector. So that's an example of a street market, a linear street market with very little investment, and trying to have a disproportionate financial spatial impact within our areas. And here's another example of how we build these infrastructures in some kind of indeterminate manner, because we need to put these things up in small incremental ways and allow for a perpetual co-production of these as and when they happen, leaning on the existing social infrastructures within these spaces. So the last one, and I think this I put in just because of the terminology around bankability that we heard yesterday, and I was interested to see how we could try to put a case forward to the economists who we try to not just work within our second economies or our microeconomies, but how do we get big capital to be complicit in making this kinds of radical moves within our cities. So this is an example of a transport node within Delft about trying to put together a compelling spatial argument, social argument, and more importantly, an economic argument on how we can bring complex land uses together where it's rather challenging within our context. Okay, so the final point to leave off is, I think that in terms of a contribution towards an African infrastructure, I'm advocating for something that is largely intelligent. It is something that where we design for a radical co-production where we don't have to do everything, and we can include a lot more people within the production of our infrastructures, and that we need to think about the small, consequential micro-maneuvers that we can help in realizing this. Thank you.
Thank you. So we'll have one round of the microphone going around, but while the microphone is coming out, and we'll get some reflections and comments or questions, maybe Tessa, does that move, that frame that Thireshen presented, that seems to align with quite a lot of the criteria you mentioned around people, integrated design, balance, and I guess the big issue is affordability or remaining within the budget envelope. Is that fair, or does that not correspond? I'm curious what your immediate response was to Thireshen's take on this, trying to think from improvised context.
I think they do correlate. I think our lenses are quite different in the sense that the scale of project that I've been working on and that which Thireshen works on is different. One of the things that I've been trying to push within the projects that we're on is changing what is the aspiration within an African context. So a lot of the projects there are quite flashy, that I showed, and there's quite a lot of money that goes into them, which is not normal within our context. But I think it's really important to have these examples that people can look to and say, well, that is an African project, that is designed by Africans, it's built in Africa, and shifting it away. And I think the work that Thireshen does is like really, especially what you showed today, is taking, it's very grassroots. It's looking at the role of individual agency, not only spatial practitioners. And that's something that's really powerful.
Thanks. Okay, I've got a hand right at the back, Alma, and then Jenny, was your hand up? Okay, Galimoto, can you just come down to Jenny? Oh, sorry, was there a hand up at the back also that I didn't see? No, just come down. So, yeah, please.
Thanks, Prof. Khumani is my name. Thanks very much. I'm very happy with this presentation, but I've been, Prof, looking at the program. Then I realized that both the programs of this conference, they're missing one aspect in this idea of African infrastructure, and that is the influence of race and racism, particularly in the context of South Africa. And I think it will be a missed opportunity for us, at least as Black South Africans in the room, whom are in fact victims of that which we're talking about today. But not just us here, but those who are outside. But I'm happy that Thireshen is touching on this thing, Shibin question and so on, because it speaks on this idea of secular colonialism and the ownership of land in our cities. 2 days back, at the beginning of the conference, there was a question about no more native informers. I think for us, it's necessary to have native informers, because if we do not talk about a colonial city, because City of Cape Town, for example, I argue that both in the infrastructure as well as the financing of that infrastructure, we're still in the colonial city. There's nothing post about it. Now, it would be interesting for me, and of course, it is interesting that now that we're discussing these matters in the program, there's a missing aspect, the politics of racism in South Africa. Because for me, there is no infrastructure without politics. For example, the City of Cape Town, you can tell with it. If you look around the city, Black people are still in the squalor in the township. The suburbia in the Rondebosch, Kemp's Bay and so on is still full of white people. And yet the question is, whose infrastructure are you building? For who? Right? Now, this conference, I don't know, Prof, whether it was deliberate or not. There's nothing touches on that. It seems to me, therefore, that we are almost massaging each other's egos. And again, back to what I said at the beginning 2 days back, that be careful of white people's fears and feelings. They might become a law. And I think if we are not honest to our white counterparts and tell them that the challenge that we are facing, even this infrastructure, futurism, about the utopian city, it will not happen because the total exclusion of Black people from participating about their own cities. And this, for me, it's what is represented in this room. And then we are talking about Africa, and you look here, Europe is here. This picture, for me, represents any other university in London, in Paris, or in the US.
So I'm just going to ask you to pause there because we have only 5 minutes for this session.
Just the last point.
Very briefly, please.
Just briefly. But I'm saying, Prof, now we are talking here about this, but you can look all around the city. What is known as illegal, informal, it's Black people who are living around the city in the informal settlements who are illegal. They are not allowed to be in the city. Whether you go now in the city, you look around, you see that. But I'm saying, Prof, it is unfortunate that race relations is not being debated yet.
Sure.
Even the idea of architecture and infrastructure without the race question in the South African context,
sure,
we are missing something.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. I've got Jenny, and then I've got Neil, and then I'm not sure we will have time to get to you, so let's just see.
Thanks.
Jenny.
Yeah, I was so interested in how these two architectural projects, speaking a similar language, kind of collide in very different anticipations. But I wondered about the connections between them and a sort of increasingly fashionable term within urban development being land value capture, which is often talked about in terms of being able to finance and fund the feasibility of the big projects, you know. So we can get land value capture to do maintenance on the road nobody wants. We can do land value capture to do the surround so that the project is more valuable financially and so on. But traditionally, land value capture equals planning gain started off as a left-wing initiative to try and grab some public benefit from these massive projects. This is its trajectory. And so I'm just thinking, why is it that there's so little tradition of planning gain across African contexts where very small investments could transform the landscape, make it more accessible and inclusive for informal, for emergent kinds of initiatives? So I was struck by the fact that you are really speaking a very similar design language and whether it's possible to kind of plug some of these wonderful anticipatory design ideas that Thireshen was talking about into bigger projects. Why not? Is this a way that you could bridge that gap to interface large projects which are often disconnected from the city into the real emergent urbanisms? So that for me was a very interesting provocation by putting these two things together. Thanks.
Thanks, Jenny. Can I, Neil, just stay in the middle, Kalimoto, and then, did I miss someone there? Okay. So Neil, and then because you've had airtime before, I'll just go to that colleague afterwards. Neil, please.
Yes, so Neil, ACC. I want to start by saying I really appreciated the presentation. I work in townships as well and also in Shebeens, and this was inspirational. To the colleague at the back, the comrade that raised the issue around race, I completely agree. But in line with that also, we also need to think about how, because SA has been chopped up in different forms by race, it has also been chopped up in different forms by gender and sex. And if we think about the Shebeen, one thing that is missing for me is how that space becomes very sexualized, and we don't think about the consequence of that in relation to alcohol and what happens in the broader space after, during, and when people go home. Thank you.
Thanks. So, sorry, one last comment there, and then very quick responses from our panelists, and then we'll have to move on. Right there, Kalimoto. No, further up. Christina, putting you on the spot there.
Thank you. My name is Tessa. My question, and somewhat touched a bit on it, it is around curriculum reform, especially when it comes to architects and planners. If maybe one of the issues is that we are still using an old template of envisioning African spaces, but perhaps we need to start right at the classroom with curriculum reform when it comes to city planners or designers. Then also a bit on maybe we also need to look at policy, because some of these things are anchored or hinges on building codes, land tenure and the likes. So I was also curious about maybe the role architects or designers could play when it comes to building codes or trying to influence policy in that respect to allow the kind of designs that we have been talking about. Thank you.
Thanks so much. So we have to stop the comments and questions there, I'm afraid, and I will ask our panelists to share some closing reflections and respond to anything they feel they have something to say about. Tessa?
I'm going to ask Thireshen to go first.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So the curriculum transformation is critical. That's not my game I play in, but I think it is critical because I think we are slowly removing ourselves from the relevance of the issue that's playing out. So yes, that's needed. How? That I'll leave to Edgar and and crew to resolve. But the thing around the policy mandate, I'm struggling a little bit with the ability for us to imagine a really progressive policy in boardrooms. I'm finding that policy is actually written in our streets and our lived reality. It'll be really interesting to find an agility between the policy makers watching some really messy but productive acts and see how that goes back into policy, because there's some things that will be quite productive to look at. And then the last closing comment is, I think that the enormity of the work to be done based on what Christian's talking about, the volume of schools, the limited resources of taking specialized skills like Tessa's talking about to build really small moments is not a sustainable thing for me. I think we need to do this at scale and crack open who the participants in this big project is. And it asks for a really different kind of infrastructure that creates a really interesting, intelligent, skeletal framework to allow others to work in this, as Jenny's talking about, in an anticipatory way, and we're leaning on the resources of many. All I'm seeing right now is that the entrepreneurial acts are some of the most progressive and urgent ones, and they are risk takers. Therefore, you see this thing about a violation against the existing policy. So my focus is literally on that. I'm not saying it's the right one, but it's the most productive one for this moment in time for me.
Okay. Thanks. Tessa?
Yeah, it was a series of very challenging and important questions. I think from my perspective, it's certainly coming from a place where I believe each of us has agency, and it's around understanding how we can contribute in the most impactful way in our cities, in our environments. And I also think that that's why we're all here. We're all here because we care, and so we're having this conversation. And then the question is, as Thireshen said, how do we scale that? Because there are only 150 of us maybe here today. So this is a drop in the ocean of the people in Cape Town, in South Africa, and Africa. So as much as we can have this conversation, what is that ability to scale? And the politics and the geopolitics, of course, is a huge part of that we have to recognize. And it's also very diverse across the continent, and each place has completely different contexts. I think connecting that with the policy question is that is a lever for scale, understanding that policy piece. And I think that does require transdisciplinary, interdisciplinary thinking. And there are members of us within this group of people today who will have more ability to shape that than others. And I think that the combination of the urgency and our agency is a key outcome for me, that we all need to be acting. And I think we all need to be doing our best. And if we come from that position where we are contributing and we're doing so thoughtfully and sensitively, and from a humble position, I think that we need to be supporting those movements forward, because it requires all of us. It's that urgent.
Thank you. So for me, what struck me about the conversation and the comments that came back is this requirement to really know what we're talking about, to have an incredibly fine-grained understanding of not just what is going on the ground, but the logics of what emerges. And I think Thireshen's mapping and illustration of what's in front of us but that we can't see is absolutely a starting point. And then there's, of course, a whole set of tools that can help us to translate that understanding into anticipatory or propositional or very careful interventions. And I think recognizing that reality and how one responds and reads it and feels it cannot be done in a non-relational way or without a recognition of history and of politics is really important. And I think it's a great segue to the next panel that my colleague Andy Tucker will lead, where we will be basically kind of just review different ways of building understanding, of building the evidence base, the interpretive capacity, and how that gets deployed to build collective response capability. So with that, I want to thank the panelists and the audience for the comments and invite Andy Tucker, the Deputy Director of ACC, to introduce his panel. Thank you.
we have an infrastructure deficit when it comes to microphones, so we are just handing over.